Hello and welcome to the Vooma podcast series, Let's Talk Faith. Today in studio, we are joined by Sulaimaan Ravat, orator and scholar, as well as morning breakfast show host and program director on Radio Islam. He's joined by Lepele, youth and young adults pastor at Grace Point. Gentlemen, welcome. Thank you so much for your time. We are talking about the role that faith and communities have played in managing COVID and how we are trying to help people get through this time, bearing in mind, of course, that it's not done. We are still going through this.
Yes.
Sulaimaan, you have a powerful platform, though, working on radio. Do you think that's really changed the game? How has it helped you to reach into communities, to get them to think about managing COVID?
You know, when I think back to that period just before the hard lockdown, I think there were three critical areas that we needed to focus on when the pandemic hit globally and then when it hit locally. One is, as a religious community broadcaster, people were looking for perspective. People were so shaken. They didn't know what to make of this phenomenon and how to respond and how to understand it and unpack it from a faith perspective. So that's the one thing that we needed to help our listeners and our community with. The other was the medical perspective, because now you were kind of having to combat whatever was being circulated on WhatsApp, theories and counter theories and conspiracy theories and whatever label you want to use. And the third thing was the political dimension, because you had now what was a hard lockdown, something we have never heard of, never envisaged. So how do you then marry the principles of your faith with the political decisions that were taken? And we had to inform and we had to encourage and we had to guide the community as to why these political guidelines and medical guidelines tied up with what the faith was saying in terms of how we needed to respond to the pandemic individually as well as collectively.
Did you find that there was a lot of suspicion in the way people regarded those guidelines that were coming through, the decisions that were made, the reasoning that informed those political decisions? Were people generally supportive?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it impacted on the religious community as well, because people, when people are scared, they don't react in a reasonable way. They react in an emotional way. So they even somewhat became suspicious of the religious leaders. That are you aligning with government because there's something in it for you? Are you aligning with a particular segment of the medical fraternity because there's something in it for you? So it was really a testing time for leadership, for community leadership, for religious leadership. You needed to stand strong. You needed to stand tall. You needed to be firm but compassionate at the same time and say, look, we understand what you're going through. We're all going through the same. So I think religious leaders, community leaders played a pivotal role in giving that perspective and say, right, as a faith-based community, this is how we react to the political decisions, to the medical guidelines, and then the discipline that was required at community level, especially when it came to aspects like the closing down of places of worship.
Yes.
It became a very emotive issue. And you found yourself conflicted as religious leaders as well, because on the one hand, it's unheard of. On the other hand, there's a strong argument that at times of extreme adversity, you need to be more engaged in congregational worship.
Yes.
And on the other hand, you've got these medical guidelines, and then you've got these political decisions, which as a citizen you also have to abide by. How do you balance all of these things? It was a difficult time.
Balance is everything. Clearly, another huge question is, are we speaking the language of the youth? And also, as Sulaimaan was mentioning, people congregate in different ways. We have to acknowledge that the youth themselves gather differently. So were we actually speaking their language and were we getting through to them? Or did you find that there was also a large amount of suspicion and distrust coming from youth groups?
Sure. I think the first thing that we need to acknowledge is, for the longest of time, there's been a over-exaggeration of the dichotomy between science and religion. And for the first time, we actually had to engage that head on. We also had to engage the overconfidence of religion, and I'll be more specific towards my religion, the overconfidence of Christianity, in saying we can still maintain monopoly as a Christian voice even in medical issues. There was that attempt that we needed to work through. So young people are getting those, they're the first recipients of these conspiracy theories. You mention it. And now you're needing to reconcile religion and science to say you can actually hold both and actually come up with workable solutions, with progressive solutions. when issues around the vaccine come, young people want to know, what does the church say? Is this the mark of the beast? That's one of the biggest things that we're coming in, and obviously that's an attempt at putting together a narrative that people can control and people can feel in control of, to say we know where this is leading to. So you had to kind of bring people into a space where they could hold the two together, holding science and holding religion, saying you can embrace a vaccine without being less of a Christian, saying you can actually acknowledge that this pandemic is a medical issue without coming across as though you are weak in your faith. That is the first thing we needed to do. Second thing, in an era of decoloniality, there's a lot of questions that are being asked by Black South African youth around why does Western epistemology have monopoly over the science field? And so then comes stuff like Mhlonyane, which was being used at the time. So people now have questions. What do we do with this? And I remember one of the ways in which we engaged this, we invited someone who was very well versed around issues of African spirituality. And they also had to ask important questions around what happens to the market that is down the road from Wits? Why have medical practices not embraced what is happening in those spaces already, so that we can have questions for such a time? So the first thing we needed to do, basically, in a nutshell, was to create spaces where all these questions could be heard, where people could learn to hold all these things in one basket and yet come out with progressive conclusions that will help people cope with the pandemic better.
You'd remember in the early stages, there was an attempt by Madagascan authorities who felt that they had come up with something important. And the South African Minister of Health said, well, we would be very happy to make South African laboratory services available to develop that traditional formulation into a kind of a cure. So is there a middle point? Would you have said, yes, this is a good idea, this is African, therefore it should work? Or were we saying, we don't know if this is going to work and we need to test this through modern science?
Look, I think we learned from white supremacy that overconfidence of any region of the world often leads to disaster. And so you need a balance. You cannot lean towards one particular region too much. But at the same time, we cannot dismiss the fact that African bioethics, when I engage in issues of healing within a traditional African context, it does not only speak to what is happening to my lungs, but it also speaks to what is happening in my family line. It speaks of stuff that psychology still has questions around, stuff like being depressed and it being owed to your genetics. And so when I go to a traditional healer, they're not only concerned with who's before them, but they're concerned even with family members that are away from me. That is liberating. So we can't ignore that. But at the very same time, we need to make sure that African religions and traditions do not fall into the same trap that Western Christianity fell into, and that is overconfidence and wanting to have monopoly over knowledge systems.
I can say with complete confidence, we are going to take a brief pause. We'll be back after this. Sulaimaan, it's not just a matter of trying to heal somebody if they've been infected with a COVID. It's also a matter of managing the associated conditions that come as a result of that sense of isolation, the rigors of lockdown. I can't go to work. I lost my job, maybe. All that has come into the conversation. So how are we using faith to address all that?
I think there was the immediate reaction, and now there's the long-term reaction. In terms of the immediate reaction, it was people being isolated from their loved ones at the time when the loved ones were infected and fighting for their lives. And the mental and emotional trauma of not being able to be close to them, to communicate with them, to see firsthand what was happening. So whilst the doctors and the scientists played their part in terms of the physical response to the pandemic, I think spiritual leaders, religious leaders had to play a part in terms of, like I said earlier on, giving people perspective, but making them understand that what's happening here. How do you react to loss? How do you react to difficulty? How do you react to challenge? Why is it part of life? To what extent are you expected to be burdened? Where are you going to find the strength from? In the place where I live, in Lenasia, you perhaps would have on average 13 to 15 funerals in the community per month. We were doing 15 per day. For the first time ever, people were going to the cemetery and seeing hearses lined up, backed up one after the other. Funerals being delayed by hours on end because of the huge number that you're dealing with. People had this burning question that what is happening and why is it happening from a spiritual perspective? And that's where we had to unpack and say, listen, history has seen worse than this. And humanity has got the resilience within it to overcome this. From a faith perspective, you look at all the scriptures. The prophets went through the most difficult of tests, but you're not burdened with more than you can bear. And you look back to your scripture, you look back to history, and you draw an inspiration and say, if they could overcome challenges of a greater nature, then surely we can overcome this. And we've got it within us. The Almighty would not have tested us with this if we didn't have it within us to rise. All of a sudden, we had to talk about death in a much more intense manner. You worry about your own mortality, your own frailty. All of a sudden, you're just seeing death all around you. As much as it was a challenge, it's also an opportunity now to introspect very deeply, to reflect in terms of the temporary nature of life, in terms of why we have been created in the first place, in terms of those that we have lost, whilst it's natural to feel the pain, and you can't trivialize the pain, you can't wish the pain away, but how we expected to use that pain as an energizer, to do better with what's left of our life, and to understand that they are in a better place, and the separation is a temporary one, and if we work to live that better life, hopefully we have a better reunion.
Did people have a sense of that the temporary nature of COVID itself?
You know, Jack, I think in many ways, one of the positives of COVID, and if I can even say that, because people may wonder how can be positive,
please.
But they always is,
Yes.
is that it humbled us. I think as humanity, we became somewhat arrogant because of our technological, digital, and all different sorts of advancements. And here the Almighty brought it before us that a virus, which is even microscopic, right, brought humanity with all of its advancement and technology to a standstill, brought it to its knees, made us realize we're not in control to the extent that we think we are in control. And that brought us to a point where we had to renew our faith and we had to re-establish our commitment to the being that is really in control. And that was the kind of perspective that we had to give to communities. I like what my colleague had to say. We had to tell them on the one hand, there's no dichotomy between religion and science. The same doctor that you would have trusted if you had a heart attack and he told you this is what you need to do, why don't you want to trust him when he tells you to take the vaccine? Right. Or when he tells you that you have to be in isolation? Or when he tells you that you cannot congregate any longer because of the kind of the situation that we're dealing with? And I think this made us realize that life is so temporary, change can be so sudden, it can be so drastic. And I'm hoping that in the long term, it will generate within us a greater appreciation for the bounty of life and a greater appreciation for the fact that don't take life for granted. You don't know what is waiting around the corner. No one with all the advancement and science that we have foretold or could have foreseen what happened here and how it changed our lives. Every single one of us. And I'm hoping this would have had a humbling effect on us and a more sobering effect. A little movement away from all this materialism and obsession with glitz and glamour and how we project ourselves on social media and start to realize what actually matters. What's actually valuable to you, what actually means something to you.
With that technological advancement, Hloni, do you think we made enough use of those advancements in technology to communicate with each other and to talk about what the pandemic has done to us and to get those positive messages out to people and to get them to consume more of the kind of stuff that was going out on media? Or did you find that the media was being manipulated by people who had another agenda, who were trying to misdirect us and spread misinformation about the reality of COVID? What was your experience with that?
Sure. I think the media played, social media, all forms of media, played a huge role in helping us find alternative ways of organizing ourselves. We took it on so much so in certain communities that I remember in youth ministry circles at some point we had a phrase called young people are zoomed out. They don't want to be on Zoom anymore. But one of the realities it also did is that it exposed our inequalities. So in a lot of regions in the world, the Industrial Revolution almost unfolds at the same pace across different cities. But in a place like South Africa, you find that while we're already engaging an advanced level of the digital revolution, in somewhere in Qobo, Eastern Cape, they are probably still on the Seke. Radio is still a big deal. Mm-hmm. And so those are some of the things that exposed. But when it comes to whether we used it or not, I would say that it exposed that the power of media does not only lie with big media brands. Yeah. For the first time, the government had to put together a strategy to engage conspiracy theories. It was so interesting to listen on the other day on a particular radio station, and they were speaking about how China has promulgated or is promulgating a law that seeks to monitor influencers and the information they bring out on their own social media platforms. And it just shows you that we've now realized that social media is power, and even without an expert qualification, you can send out information that can drive people in a particular direction. And so I don't think there was intentional propaganda. I think there was statistics. I think there was everything. But for the first time, credible media houses were needing to fight for their space against independent individuals who are lying on their bed, doing research and specializing in vaccines and everything they can think of at that moment.
Yes, I think everybody became a bit of an expert. But the point is well made about your personal responsibility and the choices that you make based on the information you have at your disposal. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. Please join us again next time on the Vooma podcast series, Let's Talk Faith, where we will further unpack the crucial role community, faith, and faith leaders have played in helping us all through the ongoing COVID crisis. And remember, COVID-19 has not gone away. And being vaccinated greatly reduces your chances of severe illness, long COVID, hospitalization, and even death.